The Second Battle of Ramadi, fought in 2006 during the Iraq War, saw the US military and Iraqi Security Forces come together to drive insurgent groups out of the city of Ramadi. In a tense and difficult battle, coalition forces sought to capture key areas of the city, allowing them to take control. This 8-month conflict is considered one of the most decisive battles in the overarching Iraq War, and many in the military believe it led to the formation of the Anbar Awakening, which saw Iraqi tribal groups reject al-Qaeda and cooperate with US forces. Join us for this documentary as we examine the Second Battle of Ramadi. Welcome to Wars of the World. Before the Second Battle of Ramadi in 2006, there was a first in 2004. It took place around the same time as the First Battle of Fallujah, an operation which involved the US military attempting to locate and apprehend or to kill the insurgents responsible for the murder and mutilation of 4 US private military contractors. While US and UK forces swarmed Fallujah, the insurgents, described as being loyalists to Saddam Hussein's Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, sought to orchestrate an offensive of their own, setting their sights on the city of Ramadi, the capital of the Al-Anbar province. Ramadi was believed to be the center of US operations, necessary for them to maintain strength and stability while at war. Believing that an attack on Ramadi would hinder US effectiveness, insurgents cut off the highway out of Al-Anbar. By this time, 2nd Battalion 4th Marines occupied the city, tasked with keeping the area and operations stable. They acted as policemen, peacekeepers, and ambassadors, attempting to build relationships with the locals, while also being aware of potential conflicts. Before being attacked by the insurgents on April 6th, these Marines had mostly only seen small-scale ambushes. But everything changed on the morning of April 6th, when the insurgents launched their assault, ambushing a squad from Gulf Company's 3rd Platoon, who were traveling south of the main supply route. 3 Marines were killed in the attack, and the rest of the squad were left injured. Though they were able to call for backup, they received no air support or artillery, as that was tangled up in the First Battle of Fallujah. Only 2 small units were available to aid the platoon. Marines from Gulf Company's 1st Platoon soon arrived on the scene. Enemy forces had scattered throughout the city, and they were next encountered west of Easy Street. The troops from the 1st Platoon engaged in a gun battle with the insurgents, and were soon able to get to the wounded group. Meanwhile, another band of troops, Echo Company, were taking heavy fire in their observation post, and those able to fight were directed to do so in order to push the insurgents out of the city. Even those who were typically non-combatants were brought in to help. The First Battle of Ramadi lasted for 4 days, resulting in the deaths of around 250 insurgents and of 12 US soldiers. Over 200 US troops were injured during the assault. By April 10th, enemy forces had either been removed from the city or killed. The conflict was considered one of the deadliest for the US, since then President Bush declared the end of major combat on May 1st that year. Ramadi was considered a hotbed of insurgency between 2003 and 2006. Reportedly due to de-Ba'athification, in which the Coalition Provisional Authority, the transitional government of Iraq, established following the 2003 US invasion, as well as succeeding Iraqi governments, attempted to extinguish the Ba'ath Party's influence on the country's political system. It was a very similar policy to that of denazification following the end of World War II, where the Allies attempted to scrub Nazi ideology from Austria and Germany. Because of this de-Ba'athification policy, Ramadi was considered to have been hit hard, as the city had strong ties to the party and its military. Driven into hiding, senior officials who were deeply involved with either became motivated to orchestrate a campaign of violence against coalition forces. Armed with tactical and technical expertise and the right contacts, they operated ruthlessly, and Ramadi soon gained a reputation as being the breeding ground of Iraqi rebellion. It was later declared to be the capital of the Sunni jihadist group, the Islamic State of Iraq, who allied themselves with the al-Qaeda during the war. In 2005, following a local Iraqi election, the 2nd Brigade, 28th Infantry Division of the US Army were able to recruit 671 individuals to the Iraqi police force. And around this time, al-Qaeda and its allies turned their attention to the city of Ramadi once again. In January 2006, the terrorist group masterminded a suicide bombing that resulted in the deaths of 56 police recruits and a US soldier. Over the next few weeks, handfuls of attacks were launched in the center of Ramadi, prompting the US Army to orchestrate sweeps throughout the city, engaging in battles with the rebels and successfully dispatching many of them. But it seemed like a losing battle, as the cleared out areas would quickly become repopulated by extremists as soon as the US had left. Furthermore, the 2nd Brigade 28th Infantry Division struggled to keep up with the constant pace and presence of rebel forces. Gunfights left them with 82 dead troops and a further 611 wounded, and they reportedly had limited intelligence on the insurgents and were under-resourced, leaving large swathes of the city without a US presence, making these areas ripe for the taking by al-Qaeda and their allies. As the months wore on, the city was subjugated to an average of 20 attacks per day. Over the next 6 months, al-Qaeda assassinated half a dozen high-profile tribal leaders. On April 17, 2006, numerous important US posts, including observation outposts like Virginia and Snake Pit, and former military compound Camp Ramadi, became the subject of several assaults, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a man known for a series of bombings and beheadings, as well as his assaults on the US during the war. Observation Post Virginia was the first one struck when an armoured vehicle containing about 1,000 pounds of explosives was driven through the gates of the post and detonated in a suicide bombing. Following the devastating explosion, insurgents on foot armed with RPGs and other weapons moved in, engaging in a brutal firefight with troops from the 3rd Battalion 8th Marines who were stationed at the outpost. They pushed back against the rebel forces, killing dozens of insurgents and managing to avoid sustaining any major losses of their own. Around this time, video footage began circulating online that showed al-Zarqawi plotting the attack, with footage of the actual event also spliced in. The video bore the logo of the Mujahideen Shura Council, an umbrella organization of at least 6 Sunni extremist groups that participated in the 2006 insurgency in Iraq. Meanwhile, recently installed Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki announced a plan in June that intended to curb the violence rampaging through the city of Baghdad. Things had grown turbulent following the bombing of the Askariya Mosque, a major Shiite Muslim shrine in Samarra. The plan was named Operation Together Forward, and was to be led primarily by the Iraqis, but with coalition support. The operation would place around 70,000 security forces on the streets of the city. They would implement a curfew between 9 PM and 6 AM, increase security and checkpoints throughout the city, and restrict the carrying of weapons. Despite all of this, however, the operation failed to increase the city's security. Huge levels of violence continued to plague Baghdad. In early June, the 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 1st US Armored Division were deployed to Ramadi to begin preparing to push out the insurgents swarming the city. By this time, military leadership as well as members of the US government considered Ramadi a lost cause, and attacks on the US forces stationed there came at all times of the day. In a report dated August 2006, Colonel Pete Devlin, the Marines' in-country intelligence chief, wrote in his assessment of the city and its province that, quote, "Prospects for securing that country's western Al-Anbar province are dim, and that there is almost nothing the US military can do to improve the political and social situation there." End quote. That same month, 33 Marines and soldiers were killed in action in and around the city. The initial success that the US government had enjoyed following its infiltration of Iraq in 2003 was beginning to wear off, replaced by growing concern. The 400,000 inhabitants of Ramadi in June 2006 were already aware of an ongoing conflict between the US and insurgents, and were fearful of the looming violence and destruction. Prompted by this, Colonel Sean McFarland, the US commander of the 1st Brigade Combat Team, opted to carry out the operation in a different manner than normal. Instead of using artillery or tank fire, or close air support, he had his men use a softer and slower approach, relying on their weapons rather than heavy-duty equipment. Tanks were primarily used during the battle to safeguard soldiers from IEDs, and were still used to target bunkers and eliminate snipers. The idea was to drive out insurgents without destroying the city and displacing the civilians. McFarland had his men take up permanent residence in the heart of the city in a bid to regain control. These combat outposts were made up of entire blocks of residential buildings, with the owners being paid a monthly rent for allowing the military to use them. On June 7th, while attending a meeting in a remote safe house, insurgent leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was killed. US forces had traced him to the location and used precision-guided bombs to destroy the building and kill those inside. Al-Zarqawi died alongside 5 other insurgents. Task Force 145 had reportedly been tracking the rebel leader for some time, but he had frequently avoided death by the skin of his teeth. He was officially confirmed dead the following day when his body was found in the wreckage and identified. By June 10th, US troops had cordoned off the city of Ramadi, and they would take to the streets with loudspeakers to warn civilians of impending attacks. Commanders stated that their main objective was to cut off the enemy's supply and travel routes by gaining control of the key entry points into Ramadi, while the 1st BCT also planned to establish new combat outposts, engage with the population, and seek out relationships with local leaders in order to strengthen their relationships with the Iraqi people, gain their support, and possibly to gain new allies. The US was also attempting to continue building up the local Iraqi police force and military, with the idea that when military soldiers moved on, the new Iraqi police and army would be able to take over and hold their own. To aid civilians, troops handed out water and electrical generators, though many Iraqi families declined to cooperate with the US, likely intimidated by insurgents. Sergeant Lonnie Russell, a Bulldog Company tanker, noted, quote, "You get a sense that they want to help you, but they're afraid for their lives and their families. It's not hard to understand." End quote. As well as the 1st BCT, numerous other units helped to protect Ramadi during this time, including the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment and the 1st Battalion 506th Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. Furthermore, the 1st Brigade of the 1st Iraqi Army Division also lent its support, along with the 1st Brigade of the 7th Iraqi Army Division. In early June, the US and Allied forces were able to reach deep enough into the city of Ramadi that they could access Ramadi General Hospital. On July 5th, it was captured by the 3rd Battalion 8th Marine Regiment. The 7-story building, equipped with around 250 beds, had been used by the insurgents to treat their wounded. Its upper floors were an advantageous position, utilized to fire down at the US in the area and launch mortar attacks. One colonel noted that the building was, quote, "basically an enemy base with facilities for the enemy, command and control, and snipers." End quote. Marines who helped seize the hospital later reported that Iraqi policemen who were taken there were often discovered to have been beheaded. There was little resistance during the takeover, and while raiding for abandoned weapons, troops found numerous triggering devices for roadside bombs hidden in the ceiling of an office inside. The US had attempted to build another hospital in the city, but it was attacked and blown up when it was almost finished. After recapturing Ramadi General Hospital, it was upgraded and opened to the public once more. Throughout the initial few months of the battle, the US made some progress towards achieving their overall goals in the city, but it came slowly, as they were frequently weighed down by engaging in heavy gunfights with insurgents on the streets, and were subject to hit-and-run assaults on the new outposts. As many as 100 extremists attacked an outpost at once, and in one conflict, dated July 24th, al-Qaeda suffered tremendous losses as they attempted to take on numerous areas throughout the city. The Ramadi Government Center was a huge target throughout the conflict. US Marines had sandbagged and barricaded the building, and in November, 1st BCT opted to bulldoze the uninhabitable buildings nearby, as they had often been used by insurgents to snipe at US and Iraqi officials who were using the building. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lee reported, quote, "The government center was one of the most dangerous areas of Ramadi. The enemy would come in from their strongholds and seize buildings across the street and attack." End quote. After the bulldozing operation, engineers began hauling away millions of tons of rubble, and it was planned that once cleared, the area would be turned into a park. Initially, Sunni Arabs were very open to al-Qaeda and their allies, in large part because of the shared anti-Shiite agenda. This led to cooperation between Sunni groups and al-Qaeda, but eventually, over the course of the relationship, the Sunni sheiks grew unsatisfied because much of al-Qaeda's terrorist actions did not line up with the wants and needs of the Sunni people. Then on August 21st, insurgents murdered Abu Ali Jassim, a Sunni leader who had encouraged his men to join the Iraqi police, which al-Qaeda did not approve of. Jassim's body was hidden in a field and was not given a proper burial, which served to both violate Islamic law and anger the people he led. Sheikh Abdul Sattar Buzai al-Rishawi was a Sunni leader in the Al-Anbar province who was very outspoken against al-Qaeda following the murder of his father and 3 mothers by the organization. He stated, quote, "I was always against these terrorists. They brainwashed people into thinking the Americans were against them. They said foreigners wanted to occupy our land and destroy our mosques. They told us, we'll wage a jihad, we'll help you defeat them." He then added that insurgents were killing innocent people, anyone suspected of opposing them. They brought us nothing but destruction, and we finally said enough is enough. End quote. He subsequently began to lead a growing movement of Sunni tribesmen who had turned their backs on the al-Qaeda brand of terrorism and sought to improve conditions for their country. Al-Rishawi founded the Anbar Salvation Council in September 2006. Composed of around 20 tribes and their 40 sheiks, the movement was dubbed the Anbar Awakening. Those aligned with the al-Rishawi were paid by the US military and Iraqi government to stop fighting against the coalition forces and to instead help patrol neighborhoods and fight against insurgents. Other reports noted that these groups received vehicles, weapons, and ammunition in exchange for fighting against al-Qaeda. According to the US military, the groups were a massive help in targeting al-Qaeda more accurately and avoiding casualties. The terrorist organization, for its part, has branded these Sunni groups as filthy crusaders and has killed numerous members in suicide bombings. By October, nearly every tribe in northern and western Ramadi had joined the awakening, with the US military reporting that by December, assaults had dropped by nearly 50%. In mid-September 2006, the 1st Battalion 6th Marines relieved the 3rd Battalion 8th Marines on the western side of the city. Its first major offensive came around a month later when it captured a building on 17th Street, where they established a joint Marine-Iraqi city outpost, which they called the 17th Street Security Station. Between November 13th and November 15th, the battle between the US and insurgents became particularly tense, heavy, and difficult. During this time, US forces are alleged to have killed at least 30 people, including women and children, in an airstrike in the city center. An LA Times correspondent in Ramadi reported witness statements that civilian deaths had indeed taken place. Marine spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Brian Salas, in a written statement, observed that while there had been an airstrike on November 14th, it had hit a bridge approximately 10 miles east of Ramadi, and that there were no casualties. 16 insurgents were killed by ground forces between the 13th and 14th of the month. That said, Salas did not dispute the possibility of collateral damage, and added that it could be difficult to distinguish between civilians and insurgents. This would not be the last time that there were allegations of civilian deaths at the hands of US troops, however. Throughout November and December, enemy forces remained deep within the city, and on November 28th, 6 civilians, including 5 children, were killed when a US tank fired into a building in an attempt to slay 2 insurgents who were using the building to snipe from. 3 months later, 900 US military members launched a month-long operation named Operation Squeeze Play. It targeted the 2nd Officers District in central Ramadi. The 2nd Officers District was named so for the fact that it was home to many former leaders of Saddam Hussein's army and had previously been a no-go zone for US soldiers. Captain John Paul Hart recalled, quote, "You used to look at a map and it'd be like the Columbus era. South of here lies dragons, because nobody ever went there. All we knew was that it was really bad, really dangerous." End quote. By this time, US troops had made good progress in the overall battle. Entrances to the city were guarded with tanks, lookout posts had been established to avoid the planting of roadside bombs, and further command posts were set up within abandoned and partially destroyed homes and government buildings. Police stations were also being opened throughout the city. While 75 US troops had been killed, over 750 insurgents had been dispatched. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Lee noted, quote, "We're not losing this. Things aren't as dire as everybody says." End quote. But still, not everyone would agree. Bomb explosions still racked the city, and snipers were known to hide out on rooftops and crouch by windows. At one US outpost, troops had to wear armored gear during daylight hours. Unemployment was rampant in the area, leading many civilians without an income to take jobs for the rebels in exchange for cash. As Operation Squeeze Play got underway, advance teams discovered handfuls of anti-tank mines, many of which were submerged in sewage in a creek bed near a neighborhood the Marines were beginning to search. At least 2 exploded during the operation, but there were no casualties, and they simply damaged armored vehicles. On December 6th, 6 US soldiers were killed during street fighting as part of the operation, 3 of which occurred in an area of western Ramadi, which was controlled by the Abu Alwan tribe, who were members of the Awakening movement. The tribe reportedly recognized the murders by insurgents as a personal attack on them, and as a result, killed or captured those involved in the assault within 10 days. Colonel Sean McFarland stated, quote, "When they say that you are my brother, and you are my brother for life, they really mean that." He added, "They felt they had been dishonored by this attack." End quote. By the end of the operation on January 14th, 2007, US forces had taken the lives of 44 insurgents and captured 172 more. Additionally, they were able to set up 4 new Iraqi police stations, meaning there were now 14 throughout the city. Operation Murfreesboro was one of the final conflicts within the Second Battle of Ramadi. Many units, including the 1st Battalion 9th Infantry Regiment of the US Army, along with Navy SEALs and members of the Marines, all became part of Operation Murfreesboro, an offensive launched in East Ramadi at the beginning of 2007. The objective of the operation was to cut off the Ma'lab district, made up of roughly 15,000 residences, from the rest of the city, which they hoped would drive out al-Qaeda forces. The US also hoped to establish 9 Iraqi police stations to help them to hold the area. Beginning on February 20th, tanks and armored vehicles were arranged around the district to halt any attempted movements in or out of the neighborhood, and to protect soldiers as they erected a permanent concrete barrier along Easy Street. Meanwhile, ground troops began organizing sweeps and targeted raids, searching for weapons, IEDs, insurgents, and high-level al-Qaeda leaders within the area, as well as within the neighboring district of Iskan. These areas were reportedly unaffected by the Anbar Awakening, which is why it was still so dangerous, despite all the progress that had been made in other parts of the city using the help of local Sunni tribes. Throughout the month, US troops and Iraqi army forces had over 40 separate engagements with al-Qaeda forces. More notably still, they discovered 8 large weapon caches, endured more than 20 IEDs, located and disposed of around 50 further IEDs, killed 69 enemies, injured 9, and captured another 32 more. The erected wall around the area was completed in 25 hours instead of the expected 36, and several permanent outposts were also built. An Iraqi army presence, as well as a police presence, helped to keep the neighborhood at peace. Operation Murfreesboro is widely credited with breaking through the insurgency in the city, helping to turn around opinions on the new Iraqi government, which had once been disliked, but now had fallen into favor. Al-Anbar province soon proved itself capable of standing alone, requiring little assistance from outside forces and allowing units stationed in Ramadi to head off to the city of Taji in October 2007 to help clear it out. Colonel McFarland would later note that his brigade had lost 86 soldiers, sailors, and marines during their latest 8-month stint in the city in February 2007. In the previous month, it was estimated that Ramadi averaged around 35 enemy attacks on US forces every day, but by August 2007, the city had gone 80 consecutive days without a single assault on US troops, leading the commander of the 1st Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division, the unit that relieved McFarland's team, to declare, "Al-Qaeda is defeated in Al-Anbar." However, though the unit was very effective, enemy forces launched attacks on and around the city in the following months. By March 2008 though, the city had become much safer, and the number of rebel attacks had dropped drastically due to the orchestration of counterinsurgency operations, which had led US troops to effectively remove Al-Qaeda from the province. Throughout 2006, it was clear that officials and leadership in the military and the US government had little hope that the situation in Ramadi could be improved. 2 years earlier, during the initial Battle of Ramadi, the commander of the Marine garrison had stated that, quote, "If Ramadi fell, the whole province goes to hell," end quote. And his sentiments were shared by commanding officers in 2006. The situation had seemed so hopelessly bleak. In November of that year, another part of the Marine Corps intelligence report noted that it would be impossible for US forces to crush the rebellion entirely, but that they also could not counter the rising popularity of Al-Qaeda. Quote, "The social and political situation has deteriorated to a point that the US and Iraqi soldiers are no longer capable of militarily defeating the insurgency in Al-Anbar." End quote. Furthermore, it added that Al-Qaeda is the dominant organization of influence in the province, and a commander reported, quote, "These guys were ruthless. They would come in and cut young men's heads off and drag their bodies through the streets." End quote. Adding to worsening problems was that much of the city's infrastructure had been completely destroyed. Raw sewage was the result of broken pipes, there was little electrical power, businesses were permanently closed, and the school system had ceased to function entirely. The citizens who did not flee Ramadi were subject to staying inside all day, every day, while the US and Iraqi army forces battled relentlessly with Al-Qaeda and their allies on the streets. And yet by the autumn of 2007, the area had been completely changed. In September of that year, the Ramadi City Council sponsored a 5K foot race that attracted 120 competitors and live TV coverage from Baghdad. Salaries for local citizens had increased by 40% following a construction boom, and the recently elected mayor, Latif Obaid, sponsored several business development councils which were keenly attended. Obaid had been appointed in January 2007, promoting stability and selecting fellow businessmen to serve on the city council. In a bid to clean up the streets, Obaid looked to begin fixing the sewage pipes, start up a trash collection service, and have burnt-out cars and other unsightly items removed from the city. He paid locals to help carry these plans out. The US helped to rebuild and directed more electricity to the city. Before long, clean running water was restored to homes, and the main road throughout the city had its blast barriers removed to accommodate for the busy traffic. With the rebuilding of the city came new businesses and market stalls, and by 2008, patrolling US forces no longer had to wear full body armor. Furthermore, the city had the fastest growing police recruitment program in the province, and was slated to eventually have as many as 4,000 police officers, though an NBC report from 2007 noted that they wound up with 8,000. While other police programs in the country had suffered from enemy infiltration and corruption, Ramadi was clear of any such problems. People scrambled to join up with the police force, not only as a way of earning money, but also because having tighter security forces led to less violence and more job opportunities. The safer the city was, the less reluctant locals were about starting up new businesses. Colonel Sean McFarland is given much credit for the progress made in the city in 2006, but so are the sons of Anbar, those tribal leaders who were part of the Anbar Awakening. Another commanding officer with the military observed, quote, "I'd say 20% of the credit for the change in Ramadi could be taken by US forces. The vast majority of the turnaround is due to the sheiks." End quote. Unfortunately, however, on September 13th, 2007, al-Rishawi, who'd started the awakening, was killed by a roadside bomb near his home in Ramadi. Though his loss was great, his murder served only to fuel the desires of Sunni tribes and leaders to see al-Qaeda brought down. Al-Rishawi was seen as a martyr. His image was used on posters and hung up on walls in offices. A parade was held in his honor on October 23rd, attended by schoolchildren and US forces alike. His brother, Ahmed Abu Risha, took over as leader of the movement following the tragedy. NBC described him as being soft-spoken but not extroverted. He did not embrace the spotlight in the way that his older brother did. Still, he believes in his brother's cause, noting, quote, "We are the only movement that is supported by all the people. We are the only people who fought al-Qaeda and won. We are good fighters and we are good builders, and now we want to rebuild this country."